Welcome, everybody. My name is Galen Scott, and I head ENSafrica's IP team. I will be facilitating today's panel discussion. We have a very diverse group joining us today for the ENSafrica webinar on the double-edged sword of reach and reputation when making use of influencers in your marketing. Attendees include marketers, in-house and external legal advisors, and even some academics. I'm certain there is also a sprinkling of current or prospective influencers in the audience. If I can please ask you to put any questions that you may have in the Q&A section, in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, and hopefully we'll have some time to address your questions at the end. Versions of influencer marketing have been around for a long time, but the ENSafrica team have found that the amplification caused by social media has increased exposure and, by extension, risk. Our team have done extensive work in this area of law, and we thought it would be a good idea to host this webinar to share some of our war stories and hopefully provide some guidance from our experience. The panel today consists of 3 members. Firstly, we have Sanesh Maharaj, who is a PR and influencer marketing expert from the multinational firm Edelman. Sanesh has deep experience in the marketing aspects around influencers and understands the local influencer ecosystem well. We also have 2 of our executives from ENSafrica's commercial IP team present. Waldo Steyn is the team lead and is an expert on all things commercial IP, but he has a specific passion for personality or image rights, which drives his interest in influencer marketing. Andre Marais has a background both in practice and as an in-house IP specialist, and so he brings a different view to these matters with a focus on finding practical and commercially sensible solutions for our clients. I'm really not exaggerating when I say that Waldo, Andre, and their team are seen as leaders and innovators in this field, and certainly among the top practitioners in Africa in this very specialist and topical field of law. Let's start with you, Sanesh. Tell us, what exactly is influencer marketing?
Hello, Galen, and hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm just checking you all can hear me. Great. Influencer marketing. I've been doing this for over 15 years now, and I think when it first started, it was just fun and it was lots of celebrities, but it's evolved so much over the last couple of years. Influencer marketing is a vibrant, dynamic space for brands to tell their stories, their news, and make consumers aware of their new products. But we live in an age of disruption, digital disruption. I think we've been catapulted into this world of digital, and the world of influencer marketing has grown exponentially. So far that there's many different formulas to it. There are programs around how brands do influencer marketing. And we at Edelman, I think we've come up with a really brilliant program to do this, and it is all centered around trust. At Edelman, we've been researching trust for almost 21 years with our program called the Trust Barometer. And our goal is any piece of work that we do, be it PR, earned, and influencer marketing, the goal here is to build earned trust and long-term trust for big brands. When we look at working with influencers and trying to understand what it really is, we build programs that help brands take their stories into a space where they can create stories for consumers and specifically target audiences that resonate with the brand. When we partner with influencers, we prefer to see them as content creators and content collaborators. Gone are the days when it's transactional. We pay you for a post X, Y, and Z. It's a lot more collaborative. We've seen such brilliant results from collaboration. Influencers understand their audiences, your audiences that you want to connect with as brands, and they're able to help us formulate different insights and content that can drive a lot more engagement and reach for brands. And I think in a nutshell, to kind of just explain it to you how it really works, is that there are different tiers of influencers. There's a macro, there's a big mega tier. So that's pretty much your celebrities, those big voices on social media. And then you get your macro influencers. Those are predominantly more specialized content creators, specializing in specific topics of conversations. And I think, and you'll hear more about this a bit later, but micro influencers, they are on the rise. They're your fans, they're your consumers. They want to be part of telling your brand story. So in a nutshell, influencer marketing is pretty much working with content creators across different tiers to be able to get your brand story out.
Thank you, Sanesh. And why has influencer marketing become so important so quickly? How is it different from other types of marketing?
I must say that, we've been catapulted in the last 2 years and pushed into a digital form of communication, expressing our emotions, telling our stories, connecting so much more intentionally through digital. A piece of research was done not too long ago by Thomson, where it showed that influencers actually yield 6 times more ROI than traditional media. And in addition to that, McKinsey did a piece of research that showed that influencer marketing is twice as strong than normal paid for advertising. That's really important to take note of. It shows you the impact of influencer marketing and being more intentional to create specific content for your target audiences. So being very customized about it. When we look at the world of influencer marketing, I say dynamic and vibrant because unlike traditional media, we get to engage. It's not simply an ad. It's not just simply a TV ad that you see on TV or flipping through a page, seeing an advertisement. Influencer marketing allows you to tangibly, in real time, engage with your audience. And I think that's so different to traditional advertising. And that's why it's so much more important. Consumers want to feel like they can talk with someone and engage with someone. And it's so important to partner with influencers to give your consumers that real-time engagement with your brand.
And any other thoughts on why influencer marketing is so effective?
So 59%, so our trust research that we do that digs into trying to understand various industries, we've actually found that 59% of consumers follow at least one or more influencers. In addition to that, 64% of consumers trust and believe influencers a lot more. I say this because it's an age-old saying we're saying in advertising and PR is that word of mouth is the best. People want to hear from people they know or people they follow what the product really does, what the brand really stands for. They want to hear tried and tested results from actual fans, consumers, and other influencers.
Thanks, Sanesh. The stats are really interesting. What are the trends that you're seeing in the market around this sort of marketing?
So I think that, it's a lot more user-generated content. I said this earlier, and I will mention this a lot more, is consumers want to be part of a brand's journey. When a consumer posts a video about them liking your product, sharing an image, that's user-generated content. That's free publicity for your brand. We're seeing a lot more of that come through. When we do influencer campaigns, we work with influencers and we make an effort to make it part of their content stream to get them to reshare what their fans are saying about their experience with the product and a brand. In addition to that, I mentioned this earlier, your fans, they are your customers. They are your fan base. They want to be recognized. So on your own platforms, hero those content pieces. Those consumers want to feel like they're buying your product, they're being celebrated for it. Their journey, their history with their product they want to be recognized. In addition to that, one of the other big trends we're seeing, and I think it's part of the conversation today, is as brands grow and this space grows with partnering with content creators, issues management is on the rise. We've seen some not so great examples of influencer campaigns and how badly that has affected brands to the point where we've seen negative sales impact on businesses. So issues management is on the rise. So partnering with the likes of ENS and having a team to be able to crisis manage when those partnerships have troubles, it's really important.
Thanks so much for your insights, Sanesh. Moving now over to some of the legal considerations. Waldo, tell us, what is the legal basis for the influencer arrangement?
Thanks, Galen. So what we see when we work with clients quite often is that they're sort of kind of tend to fall into one of two approaches. One, sort of people sometimes view these arrangements as a kind of a license arrangement almost, and others see it purely as a services arrangement. And I think it quite often is the reason or follows from the fact that in-house counsel tries to fit this into a mold that they understand or work with already. But there are effectively three different pillars to influencer arrangements. The first one is the core, and that's the image rights. Now, I know we have people from outside of South Africa joining us as well, but from a South African point of view, these are personality rights. So that's the right to dignity and your identity and privacy and all of those things. These are rights that cannot be alienated, so you can't assign them to anyone else. And that's really where the core of the protection or the legal relationship lies. And the type of language is an authorization on the one hand to use those equities. So the image, the voice, the likeness, all of those things. You want to have nice language in the agreement that talks about an authorization similar to the licensing language that you might have wanted to use. But in addition to that, there is an element that talks about association. Now, the association element may be implied in the authorization, but we generally try to express that quite clearly. What is the brand owner authorized to associate with, or how does that relationship work? Is it a specific product brand? Is it a specific category? Is it for a specific period of time? And that's quite critical because remember, because these are such fundamental rights to an individual, you have to be quite careful how you craft your authorizations around that. So that's pillar one. Now, what we've seen with influencers and celebrities over the last several years, I mean, it's not a new thing, is the protection of their image equities in forms such as trademarks, for example. So what we've realized is that one of the pillars, in addition to the image rights, is actually to make sure that you're looking at things like trademarks and copyright, sort of those kind of equities as well. So the second pillar is check whether there are any registered rights or any copyright in, for example, photographs, and make sure that your agreements speak to that pillar as well. And then the third pillar, and this is really the practical one, and this is where initially we saw a lot of agreements failing, and Sanesh actually alluded to this when he was speaking to the collaboration. It is a services agreement in the end. An influencer means very little to you unless there is a very good framework and understanding of what actually is this person supposed to do for you. So historically, that was simply he would do X number of posts in X number of time, so many engagements in this way. It was very formalistic. And what we've realized is that if there isn't a very high level of collaboration between the brand owner, the brand agency, and the influencer, there is just a recipe, I don't want to say a recipe for disaster, but a recipe for the investment to fail. So again, the three pillars I would say are image rights, these very unique set of rights, the intellectual property rights associated with that image or the image equities, and then the services, which are really, really critical.
Thanks, Waldo. Can you perhaps share with us some of the learnings that you and your team have taken out of influencer agreements over the past few years?
So Galen, we've been very lucky that we've had a long relationship with some great clients over the last number of years, and we've really helped them to build out their use of influencers at a time when the South African influencer industry, if I can call it that, was really at its infancy. And some of the challenges that we picked up is that people who represent, so agents who represent influencers, quite often were making up things as they were going along because simply it was an unknown quantity. They were taking learnings from other types of arrangements and trying to force that into an influencer arrangement, but quite often not knowing the bits that they didn't know. So the first thing sort of that I think is important to share with our audience is that you have to consider quite carefully who are the parties to your agreement. So let's say it's the brand agency. And then we say, okay, well, we've got the influencer, but these days influencers are all represented by agencies, and you would typically contract with an agency. And then a lot of our clients actually have their brand agency as a party to the agreement to funnel or to flow the payments through, because they're internal procurement systems, but also to have a contractual basis for the brand agency to engage directly with the influencer's agent. So the first thing, you've actually got to stand still for a moment and think about, well, what does the construct or the structure of this agreement look like actually? Who are the parties involved? And one of the learnings I really do want to share with the audience is we've had a situation where where our client contracted with an agent of an influencer, and that agent and the influencer had the worst divorce you can imagine. It was so bad that they ended up in litigation against each other. And the client's initial contract was drafted so that it spoke to the engagement of the agency and its obligations with respect to the influencer. But the problem then became, how do you pay an influencer or make sure that influencer receives payment when you are obliged to pay its agent, who is now fighting with the influencer? And remember, we're talking here about social media and reputation, and the narrative becomes the brand is not paying me, the influencer. Although that's not the true narrative. That is what people sort of hear and the story that they hear. So it's again, step back, think about this construct of the agreement, these different parties, but how do you pull the influencer directly into your agreement in case that relationship with the agent goes completely wrong? And this isn't an isolated case. We've seen this in so many instances happening. It may be that in other jurisdictions, the industry is more mature and those relationships are better managed, but here we've seen that quite often. And we've had to develop mechanisms to actually craft relationships around that and step-in rights and termination rights that actually speak to getting an agent out and getting an influencer directly back into the agreement without having to terminate the agreement with all of the parties. I think one other thing, sort of as relationships go, we've also seen several times where relationships between the brand agency, who we quite usually make part of our construct, and the brand owner goes wrong, Galen. And that's very difficult as well, where you have someone who no longer wants to work with you as a brand, and yet you're tied into this influencer arrangement with that brand. So when you think about the parties, also think about everything that can go wrong, like we do in contracts. And it sounds like I'm talking about anti-nuptial contracts here, but it's important to think about those different elements. So I think parties for me would be the first theme. Sort of stand still, think about who are the parties and role players in this engagement. Then the next thing I would say is the articulation of the services. In the early years, it was very formalistic, like Sanesh said. And even then, the parties didn't understand the extent to which they had to actually spell out what parties are required to do. Now, remember, at this day and age, you want to know, is my influencer actually performing the service, and am I getting a return on my investment? So that's why a level of that formalistic approach must remain. There must be X number of engagements, however you describe them. There's going to be a photo shoot probably. There's going to be some brand engagement that's sort of at events, things like that. You have to govern for all of that. And all of the services type of arrangements that typically would go with that, whether you pick up costs for incidentals and flights and the sort of what level of flights those would be. And all of those different things are very relevant to that services arrangement. Something that I want to mention, which is maybe a little bit sort of on the fringe, and what I mean with that is that you're not going to get this in every single one of your agreements, but we've had several agreements where we've had influencers who are celebrities outside of South Africa, for example. And then it becomes very important how you articulate your payments from a tax point of view, because withholding taxes may apply to intellectual property related payments, but not necessarily at the same level to services. So we've had to actually, in those arrangements, also think, how do I link up my payment mechanisms to the type of rights that they relate to? So in South Africa, you've got a 15% withholding tax on both royalties and services, but there are two different filings with our tax authority, which means you still need to split them up, even though the withholding tax is the same. So that's something else to think about. So we've thought about the parties. We know that the services are really important. And then we've got to think about, how do I match up my payments and my services if this is a transaction where I've got to make some kind of filing or report to a tax authority. And that leads me straight into the payment section. And again, having had the benefit of being involved in this for so long, we've seen such a range of payments that work and don't work. Worst case scenario, I'm going to share with you straight away. This was a contract concluded by an FMCG company for a very, very good cause. It was, they were doing something in rural areas, really helping the people on the ground. And we were acting for the brand, so for the FMCG company. And they unfortunately concluded this contract without us being involved in the first instance. But what happened was the payment was structured in such a way that they paid approximately 75% of the payment on signing of the contract. And it was a year contract, which means that the risk retention or leverage element was a measly 25% of that total amount. Now, what happened in this project was that the construction, so the builder, they had to build something in this rural area at the school, and it just went completely wrong. And then the influencer said, well, I'm not going to be associated with this poor constructed sort of small building, and refused to engage at all. And what happened in that case is that it was so difficult to find a way to get the influencer to engage in the way that the client needed to get that engagement. And ultimately, I'll be honest with you, that is one of the worst examples of a failed influencer relationship that I've ever seen. So what is the message that I'm trying to give to you here? It is that you have to think very critically about how you structure that payment mechanism so that you don't give everything at the beginning. There must be an incentive, not a stick, but an incentive for the influencer to continue to honor the relationship and to perform the services. Andre is going to sort of talk about when things go really wrong in these relationships and termination and how to deal with that in a practical way. But what he's going to sort of tell you basically is that these are very difficult engagements to walk away from in a way that turns out bad. Okay, so the key message there is think about your payment structure. How is that going to work to incentivize your influencer and provide you with a kind of a risk retention up until the end of the engagement? So obviously there will be staggered payments, and we even sort of link those to certain KPIs. Okay, so Sanesh touched on user-generated content, and I want to link back, we are an IP department, to an intellectual property element here. And that has two elements to it. On the one hand, remember, a lot of content will be generated, and we typically require that content to be owned by our clients. So typically the big, or the brands, the FMCG companies, the people making use of the influencer, because they invest in creating that content, and because they wouldn't want the influencer to be able to use that or someone else to use that in the future, and they would be the only party who would probably have an incentive to police it. So that's an intellectual property element about ownership of content being created. But there is also another element. And we've had a situation with an influencer. So it was a deal agreement, a lot of influencer elements to it, but also there was a product endorsement element to it. So the image of this person actually appeared on some of our clients' products. And this image was provided by the agent of this influencer. And lo and behold, about 6 months before the end of, I think it was about a 3-year contract or so, copyright infringement claim from the photographer, who claimed absolutely he owns the copyright. Now, in that case, business are typically very weary. They want to run and settle any kind of thing that may look like a problem. They should never have settled that, yet they only paid 50,000 Rand to settle that particular matter, whereas the photographer never actually had any claim. But the problem there for us was that there wasn't adequate warranties in this arrangement as far as the content being provided by the influencer and the agent related. So what does that mean? It means that at some point you're going to rely on your influencer to share certain content with you. And you want to make sure that that won't infringe, it's not going to offend. But the key thing there is if you're going to use something on a more, for example, on a product or on marketing material collateral, you want to make sure that you have a warranty and an indemnity that protects you. Okay, so that's the intellectual property element, both in content being created and owning being that, and content being provided and the warranties and indemnities you have to think about around that. The last clause or learning that I want to share relates to what we refer to simply as a morality clause. Now, when we thought about this webinar today, we had this idea of the double-edged sword and this whole tension between you wanting to associate with someone with a huge following or a deep following because people will trust what they say. The flip side of that is that if something goes wrong, the reputational harm is equal. Now, what is critical in this arrangement is that there is a clause that in detail describe the ability of let's call it the brand owner or the brand company to walk away from this relationship. If, for example, you have a situation where your influencer is completely drunk in public or is sort of certain allegations of criminal misconduct is made or against this person, or thinking specifically about a South African and sort of context, but also about what we've seen happening in the world, sort of allegations of what's the right word, racial sort of slurs and things like that are being made. You want to be able to walk away from that kind of relationship. So we've developed a very comprehensive morality clause and the ability to walk away from these agreements. And that's critical in any engagement with the influencer. An interesting thing I can share with you around that is that we've had sort of a number of very high profile matters in South Africa where brands were attacked publicly on social media, where influencers did things wrong, or brands were perceived to have done certain things wrong. And that actually led to certain influencers asking of our clients for a similar morality clause that allows them to walk away from agreements. That's not something that's carried through. It was at a particular point in time that we saw that in one or two agreements, but I'm mentioning that to you so that when you come across it, you must also appreciate as a brand owner, and I'm speaking as if I'm only speaking to brand owners, but that influencers equally have an obligation to themselves to protect their reputation. So that's why they would ask for something like that. So be sensitive and aware of that kind of change that has taken place. Galen, those are some of the learnings and stories that I wanted to share. I hope that gives a feeling for some of the key elements in these agreements that really stand out for me.
Thanks for sharing some of your war stories, Waldo. I think that they'd be of interest and benefit for certain to the listeners. Andre, turning to you now. One of the main topics you have been harping on about over the past months is risk assessment in influencer arrangements. Tell us, how do you assess risk in these matters?
Thanks, Galen, and hello to all of the attendees. So first of all, assessing risk is always a little bit of a fluid challenge, and it will always depend on what your brand is, what your risk appetite is within the brand. Thinking of some examples, a conservative wine brand may have a very different view on what's acceptable risk to them versus, I don't know, a nice shoe brand or a up-and-coming tequila brand or whatever the case is. So it's important to firstly understand that you need to adjust your risk appetite to your specific brand and what you can and can't handle. When we typically look at risk and advise clients around which influencers they should engage or how they should think about which influencers they should engage, we think about three elements. The first one is, and all of them are pretty obvious, but you need to read them together. The first one is the reach of the influencer, basically how famous they are. And in the old days, these things were a little bit arbitrary, but these days you can literally go and drill down into what they're following on social media. And looking at this in the South African context, you can literally go and look at how many Twitter followers they have, how many Instagram followers they have, where are they active, how many Facebook followers they have for the older people in the crowd. So you sort of aggregate all of that, and then you find out what is the reach of this influencer going to be. And based on that, you make a determination of what's that first element of risk. The second one is the value of the campaign, or you can see it as a brand, but we like to look at it in specific campaigns. So how much are you as a brand going to spend on this campaign to push this influencer sort of front and center? And if it's a small little 50, 60,000 Rand campaign or whatever the case is, then obviously your risk is much, much lower. But if you look at the long-term engagement with an influencer, a 1 year or a 2 year type of engagement, then that becomes much, much more important, because then obviously the exposure is going to be longer and it's going to be deeper. As an example, if you choose an influencer, let's say you choose Miss World to be the face of your product, and her face is going to appear not only on social media and all these other places, but actually on product and so on, then obviously your risk exposure is much, much bigger, because then it's not a question of taking down some offensive posts. Then it becomes a question of withdrawing products from the market, all of those type of things, if things were to go south. The third element I've already touched on is the timing element. We have some campaigns that are literally a day, 2 or 3 days, whatever the case is. And typically they're relatively low value as well. They're sort of a hit and run type of advertising campaign versus the longer term engagements. So if you look at those 3 elements, those are the 3 things that we consider when we determine risk. There is a fourth element, and one that we're seeing pop up more and more. It's not a formal sort of measurable or anything like that, but we are finding that brands are starting to consider the personalities of the influencers more and more when they select who they want to use. And that's obviously just a perception more than anything else. But we have found that some of our very big clients simply do not want to work with certain influencers. They might tick all the boxes from deep following and authenticity and all of those type of things. But as a brand, they simply don't want to associate themselves with this person. And that can either be a trait of the influencer, or what we're finding more and more is the deliverables of the influencer are starting to be questioned. So the person may be spectacularly famous or good looking or whatever it is that you require for your specific influencer arrangement, but rumors have started walking around in the market that this person simply doesn't sort of come to the party, or they don't deliver, or they're difficult to deal with, or whatever the case is. And these things are genuinely starting to play a role. We have some of our clients that they burn their fingers once and they will move on. They will not engage with that influencer again. And that fourth element is really one to sort of keep in the back of your mind, both as an influencer and as a brand.
Thanks, Andre. And can you tell us what practical learnings have you picked up along the way? So learnings beyond the influencer agreement clauses that Waldo has mentioned.
So there are many, and some of them are war stories and some of them involve our clients. So we have to sort of dance around some of it a little bit. But I think the first one is really, Waldo has touched on it and Sanesh has touched on it, and that speaks to the practical implementation of an influencer arrangement. So we draft lovely service annexures to the agreement, and it sets out what we believe to be exactly what the deliverables should be in a specific case. But the reality is influencers are very popular and they're very pretty and they a lot of things, but project managers, we find they are not. So the first practical thing that we usually advise clients is to get those service annexures to get as close as possible to paint by numbers. It should be very simple to implement, both for the influencer, but also for the brand. We have found quite a few arrangements where the services are fine, the influencer is fine, they're all on board, everyone sort of wants to make this work. They simply don't really take that practical step though. And that's where firms like Edelman or so can come in to really help you guide with that process. It comes down to the level of detail of you need to post an Instagram post on the 14th of February at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. This is what needs to be said, and this is a button that you need to press. It really does get that detailed, and it's very important to sort of hold the influencer's hand to make sure that the implementation happens practically. On that same point, Waldo mentioned ROI, and ultimately what you want to do is you want to judge how successful this arrangement is. And part of judging that is measuring your return on investment. The nice thing is there is very, very good software out there that really measures how effective each post of a social media influencer is. Obviously, some of the other types are a little bit more difficult to measure. If you've got a famous rugby player pitching up at your casino's launch, That's quite different from him posting a video about that same launch and more difficult to track. But that's something that we find more and more important, is to build in those KPIs and how the ROI will be measured in the actual agreement, and to make sure that the influencer and his agent understands what is expected of them. That leads me to another point. The last point just on that one that I also want to mention is, when you think about managing the implementation of an influencer arrangement, it is of supreme importance that you also manage the exit of that relationship. Some of the most volatile matters that we had to deal with was actually post-termination of influencer arrangements, where for whatever reason the brand didn't take down the signage in all of the shops that they needed to, or they kept sharing some things on YouTube after the influencer arrangement terminated, that type of thing. And that's a big no-no. Obviously, it's not even a breach of agreement anymore. It's just an infringement of someone else's rights. And it really is important that you manage that exit from the relationship. Jumping over to agents, I think Sinesh has mentioned it and Waldo's mentioned it, and we can have a whole webinar just on agents and exchanging war stories on agents. Some of them are absolutely fantastic, some of them not so much. We have found that the professional agents really do facilitate the process, and they're excellent at what they do. They help with the implementation, they help to get the influencer across the line, they just help with implementation and anything that you need. The flip side is some of the less professional agents are just a hurdle to the implementation and to every step along the way. Waldo did mention the story about influencers and their agents getting divorced, and it gets very messy, and your brand is the children caught in the middle of an ugly divorce. It's not a situation that you want to find yourself in. So understanding where the agents fit into this relationship is very important, and making sure that you maintain a good relationship with the agents is important as well. Just like we said, some brands don't particularly want to work with certain influencers anymore. We are finding more and more that some brands don't want to work with agents anymore. So now you're almost taking one step further away from the influencer, and if a specific agent pitches up in a discussion, then the brand just goes, well, we've worked with this guy a few times before, it's simply not worth it, we'll move on to the next agent. And that's quite an important thing to think about. I think that's all I have on that for now, Galen. I can keep talking for a long time, but I won't.
Thanks, Andre, for sharing the tips with us. Any tips from an enforcement perspective?
Yeah, that's the one where things usually turn ugly. And again, we can have an entire webinar just sharing stories about that. But I think some of the important things that people need to realize is, Waldo's already touched on this, but you need to realize that there are two brands involved here. The one is your brand as a brand owner, but the influencer also has a brand. And if you look at these things holistically, your brand probably can take a few shots if it needs to, but the influencer brand probably can't. If they get a reputation for not delivering, or they do something naughty that steps outside the morality clause, effectively that brand is destroyed, and that person's whole existence as an influencer just goes away. So when you enforce these type of agreements, it's very important that you bear that in mind from both parties' perspectives. It's not the type of arrangement that you can run off to court and go and try and enforce, because the reputational harm to both the brand and the influencer's brand is simply too big. So you need to make both parties understand what the risk is and why it's so important for them to find some form of a mutual separation that works for both parties. The second part of that is it's not litigation, it's PR. It's we finding more and more, we advise on the agreement, the breach of the agreement, and all of those type of things. Then we move all of that to the side and we go to the Sineshes of this world. And even a lot of our clients have internal communication specialists, and they come and sit next to us and they help us with how do we communicate this narrative, both to the influencer and more importantly to the wider audience, to our fans that Sinesh mentioned, to the people that actually follow that influencer. How is this divorce going to play out in public, and how are we going to communicate that? The interesting thing on that is I had this discussion with one of the other people from Edelman a while back, and one of our clients asked for some examples about where they were so successful with these PR implementation strategies of them. And the person from Edelman actually pointed out that the most successful PR campaigns are the ones that you don't know about. So if there's a messy divorce between your brand and an influencer and the public don't know about it, it means that the PR agency did an excellent job, because either they don't know about it or the narrative that you wanted to push is actually out there. So it's a sort of interesting thing to just keep in the back of your mind. And then the last thing I want to mention on enforcement is we're finding this more and more outside of the influencer arrangement as well, Galen. I think you'll know it more than anyone else, is when you get involved in these type of argy-bargies, assume that every single thing that you do will end up in social media. So if you send an angry lawyer's letter or an angry brand letter, assume that the first thing the influencer will do is post it on their social media feed, and you will look like the bad guy. There's no way to couch a legal letter, a slightly strongly worded legal letter, where the brand looks like a shining example and the influencer looks not so great. So you have to think about those things extremely carefully. How will the public take this, and how will it land, especially with the fans who have more of a vested interest with the influencer than with the brand? So think about that element very carefully when you engage in any sort of litigious activity with influencers.
Thanks for those insights, Andre. Certainly a lot for us to think about. And I know just from a litigation perspective, those factors certainly are things that my team has to take into account these days. Looking towards the future now, Sanesh, what is your view on the future of influencer marketing? Should brands continue to pursue this marketing channel?
Yeah, thanks for that. And brilliant question. I think we've heard a lot from Waldo and Andre about all of the very tough situations that we do end up in and how we can kind of navigate our way through that. And I have to say that just to quickly respond to that is that it all goes down to having an agency team that is going to help you build trust with these partners. We at Edelman have been managing influencers for the last 10 years, and almost every single year we win 3 to 4 big awards on our campaigns with influencers. And I think one of the winning factors that we have is building trusted relationship with our influencer partners. And I mentioned this earlier, the key thing is collaboration. If there's a trend that I ask you to look out for as a brand, as a content creator, it's collaboration. Collaboration and being open to build a partnership, not short-term. Short-term partnerships don't exist anymore. That wham-bam experience with influencers don't benefit a brand. It doesn't benefit the influencer. We're looking to build long-term partnerships. That's a key insight that I think we must take forward if we're going to continue to pursue working with influencers. I have to say that from some of the stats I told you earlier, from the 64% of consumers who still believe in influencers, still follow influencers, influencers is a growing market. It's maturing, however. Like the team spoke about, from contracts to influencers feeling a sense of ownership, brands being able to hold influencers accountable, it's growing and it's maturing. And for businesses, brands, it's really important to be able to find measurable results to show that these campaigns are working with your partners. And I think that measurement has become so questionable. We spoke about this earlier with contracts. Every campaign has its own objective. And what we found as a major success is that when we sit down and take a content creator or a partner on the journey with us, pre-contract, pre-going live, taking them on a journey to tell them what the campaign is about, how they want to get involved, that builds so much of added value with the content creator. And at that juncture, you can already gauge whether someone's interested and the value of return on investment you're going to get. And I think just some of the key things I really want people to be mindful of when it comes to partnering with influencers and just content creation as a whole. Diversity is so important. We've seen this go wrong so many times. Diversity and being able to drive equitable content and partnerships is pivotal this year. Brands will be held accountable. As the team mentioned earlier, brands are under fire this year. Consumers will hold brands a lot more accountable. So be mindful of who you partner with. We at Edelman, we do a lot of work to vet our content creators so that the authenticity of the brand partnership is real, it's tangible, it's believable. Nothing should be done with the intention to score a quick engagement post. And then lastly, so two last things is your employees and consumers are your micro influencers. They can yield some of the biggest engagement results for you. They want to be recognized. I mentioned this earlier. So partner with your employees, develop employee programs. We've seen employees have a voice. If they're not talking about your product, it's a problem. They should be. They support your brands. In addition to that, consumers want to be a voice for your brand. And then lastly, there's a lot of work being done to help influencer campaigns, content creators become a sales force to these influencer-led campaigns. So yeah, in summary, diversity is really important, making sure that you are looking to your micro influencers, which are your own employees and your consumers, and building campaigns around them, and then making sure that you're looking to extend your campaigns to be a sales force and bring the results back to your business.
Thanks, Sanesh. So it seems that influencer marketing is certainly here to stay. And thanks to the entire panel, Andre and Waldo as well, for your insights. We've now moved on to the Q&A session. I see that we do have some time left. I'm going to ask Waldo to work through the Q&A and to answer, put to the team to answer some of the questions.
Thanks, Galen. I would like to start actually with a question related to authenticity. So Sanesh, sort of for me, always one of the key elements of the whole influencer sort of marketing success is the fact that consumers, theoretically at least, believe, associate, and you use the word trust, these individuals. And that trust, I think, or I would assume, is based on a level of authenticity. Now, there is a terrible but wonderful example in the US related to an ice cream brand, where an influencer who promoted this ice cream brand walked into the ice cream store and was then videoed walking out and throwing the full sort of little thing with ice cream into a bin literally 2 meters away from the door. And that, of course, killed authenticity there straight away. So we've had a few questions about authenticity, and I'm going to ask it in two parts maybe. So the first one is, are you aware of any research or sort of studies having been done on the perception of the authenticity of influencers? That's the first part. And the second part is sort of how believable or authentic are influencers still when so many consumers believe or think that the content that they post is actually being created or essentially scripted by the brands that they represent?
I think we have to factor in that influencers are humans. We're all humans. And I think the example that you gave was a particularly key example to show that the authenticity, the vetting, the homework behind the scenes was not done well. We have to, when we look at partnering with influencers, it's a long sit-down conversation. It's a journey with the brand. There's a lot of interviewing processes that happen when we sit down to make someone a big brand ambassador versus a short-term campaign, depending on a level of influences. I think what brands sometimes miss is that, and in that particular example, it was reach and engagement that the brand was after. And the living the lifestyle association and vetting that didn't come through in the homework that was done. There is research, our trust barometer, which digs into trying to understand trust with working with influencers and brands. I think I mentioned this earlier, 59% of consumers follow influencers. They're still following influencers. That's half of the population. In addition to that, 64% of consumers still believe in influencers. We're always going to find it's never going to go away. It's never going to be the perfect world because people still make mistakes. But it's important that you do your homework because it's still a growing industry. They're growing fans and they're able to connect with your consumers in a unique way that advertising just doesn't.
Thank you, Sanesh. I'm not going to move off that topic just yet. I think there are two components we need to touch on. The one is that as lawyers, we typically draft contracts to be as risk averse as possible, which means that there is a tremendous detailed vetting process for content. And sort of, or typically there is. And I think one of the messages we all need to take away from this is that as risk averse as we may be, we need to ensure that we find a voice, or we create the environment for a voice that is still authentic. So that's the first thing. But there's something else I want to touch on there. And that is, if you have an influencer and today he is punting one personal care brand, and tomorrow, wow, he's punting another one. And tomorrow or the day after, he's punting yet another one. That is a huge problem. Andre, can I ask you to maybe just touch quickly on exclusivity as a function of the agreement that actually speaks to not only the protection of the investment, but authenticity as well?
Sure, thanks, Waldo. Yeah, I think that's a very important element in a lot of these agreements, is to sort of manage the optics around the engagement of the influencer with the brand. And a big part of that is that the influencer actually wants to use that product and buys into using that product. And, you know, throwing away the ice cream is one thing. Buying an ice cream from another shop is potentially a much bigger issue. So what we typically do is we would build in some form of exclusivity into the agreement, and that can be as wide or as narrow as it needs to be within the specific engagement. But what we would do, for instance, let's use personal care. So we would, for instance, write in that the influencer can't act as an influencer or a brand ambassador for any other personal care products. And those clauses are actually quite detailed. We would go into detail to say whether, you know, what is defined as personal care brands. You know, is mouthwash personal care, or, you know, is it deodorant? Or it goes into that level of detail to, first of all, make sure that you protect the client's investment, but also bear in mind that the influencer, that's his business. He needs to run his business. So he needs to still have the freedom to engage outside of risk for our client, but still engage with other brands, and bearing in mind that that can actually make him more famous, which translates into more hits for your brand as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Andre. Sanesh, I've got a question for you, and I hope I'm not going to put you on the spot here, but sort of the question is, can you maybe give an example of an influencer campaign that stands out for you as something that has really almost reached the point of changing behaviors?
So there is a global soap brand well known for changing the narrative around beauty. And at a global and local level, there have been partnerships with well-known TV personalities who are shaping a different voice for women in beauty, in addition to local voices in the fashion industry changing the way women are seen. We saw through these campaigns an actual shift in two places: growth for the brand in terms of its perception, talking about societal issues, partnering with people that actually have vested interest to move the needle on societal issues. And then in addition to that, that long-term trust, because it's been work done over a period of over a decade, we've actually seen results in the sales. So there is the potential that when you partner with the right people that are vested in the intention behind a campaign, the results are phenomenal.
Excellent. Thank you, Sanesh. I don't want to unnecessarily bombard you with questions, but the next one I'm going to throw your way as well. And because it actually links, I think, with what you said were some of the themes or key things that you are seeing at the moment. And the question is there a minimum number of followers that you would require or think of to say, okay, someone is actually able to function or perform as an influencer?
It's a bit of a double-edged sword question, Waldo, because I have to try so firstly, let's say anybody can be an influencer. Anybody could post anything. If the right people pick it up, it can go viral. Be it positive or negative. We hear of Black Twitter, we hear of underground Twitter. These are not people with large voices. The conversation actually starts at a very underground level with day-to-day people driving these conversations on social media platforms. Anybody could be an influencer. Technically, we're looking for, when it gets to the work, anyone above 1,000 followers can be deemed as an influencer. But I have to say that every brand must look at what your objective is. Do you want to drive conversation? If you want to drive conversation, you're not going to get that with someone that has high following. You're going to get that with someone with medium following, because they can engage with that audience and they're vested in that audience. A mega influencer sitting at 1 million followers or 800,000 followers, they don't have the time to drive high engagement. So it must be practical when brands look at engagement and influencers. What do you want to drive? Reach, engagement, conversation?
Excellent. Sanesh, thank you very much. I think we have time probably for one more question, and the one I'm going to go to is, or deals with content after termination of the agreement. And there are two sides to this. The one relates to the content that remains on platforms controlled by the brand, and the other is the content that remains on platforms that are controlled by the influencer. The question we received is actually sort of, do we require typically that people retain that content on their platform, or should it be taken down? And Andre, I'm going to be unfair. I'm going to ask you to comment on that question and about the content, please, after termination.
Sure, thanks, Waldo. I did briefly touch on that in some of the learnings, but that is such an important element to understand what you can't do and what you can do after termination. So the rules are typically set out in the agreement, and we like to be quite specific about what it is that you can keep on doing and what you can't. For matters within your control, typically the requirement is that the content should be taken down because you no longer have rights to it. But bear in mind that these things take on a life of their own and they get out from under your control quite quickly. So it's important that the agreement provides for, and that the influencer understands, that once these matters are outside of your control, then you shouldn't have an obligation to go and chase it anymore. If something gets reshared by other people or gets picked up and reposted on someone else's website, then you shouldn't have an obligation as a brand to go and chase it to try and take it down. But as I said, the important thing is, if you still have control over that and you have an obligation to do that, you need to take it down. We have, I can't tell you, probably one a month, a matter that pops up where an influencer from 4 or 5 years ago crawls out of the woodwork and makes some claims against clients who didn't take down content, and now claim usage for the last 5 years or 8 years or 10 years or whatever it is. And they revert to what their fee was at that stage times 8 years. And I mean, we just start so far apart on those type of discussions on what they think they're entitled to and what we think they're entitled to. So those are ugly scraps. And those are the type of things where your legal fees exceed your settlement fee at the end of the day. But because the potential risk issue is so big, you simply can't walk away from those engagements. It's a very important element to understand post-termination obligations on content.
Okay, I'm going to actually take one more question. Thank you, Andre. And Sanesh, sort of, this one is for you as well. And to some extent, I think maybe you've answered this, but there are a lot of questions about how do you measure the success of an influencer campaign? How do you determine what those KPIs maybe should be? If you can maybe just help a little bit with the understanding around that, please.
Sure, 100%. And I also just quickly want to, if I can, just touch on the previous question as well. I mean, we've worked with partners who have partnered with us on campaigns for a year, and they're so purpose intentional about the campaigns that we create. They're vested in it. They create beautiful pieces of content because they're so proud of it. They're not coming to us to ask us to take it down. So I think what I really want to drive home here is that when you simply create a piece of content that looks like an ad, I definitely feel there's a lot more keenness from influencers to go, right, my partnership's done. If you use it again, I want fees for it. But when you're creating campaigns and partnerships with brands to build trust, you should be doing purpose-driven work. You should be doing work that's going to change society and help consumers. your partners, your consumers, the content creators that you work with should have a vested interest to want to make sure that piece of content lives out there and they're proud of it. And we've had partners, like I said earlier, whom we've created content with that's never ever come back to say, please take something down. And they still enjoy how this piece of content still gets reshared till this day. But coming back to answer your question about measurement, I have to drive this home again. The landscape has changed drastically. You have to, as a brand, understand what it is your objective is. I would say that it all comes down to making sure that you're building trust and affinity for your brand. How do we measure that then, right? If we're using an influencer partner, it must come back to doing something to help improve your brand. So share of voice in the conversation. So if you have a trending hashtag, or if you are talking about a specific subject, take, for example, real beauty or healthcare, what is the current conversation at the moment? And using your content partners, how are you intercepting that conversation and what are you saying? We then go back, because love research, I'm an analytical person, so I love going back to deep dive into that, looking at the share of voice of what the conversation is around beauty and how your conversations with your influencers are intercepting that. So share of voice is one of them. The good, honest basics, engagement and reach is important. But again, that hinges on what is your objective for the campaign. Engagement is no longer about likes. Instagram is taking off the like function. It's about conversation, driving meaningful conversation. Deep diving further, what types of conversations are these influencers having when they post content? Are the agencies you're working with deep diving into trying to understand that? And when you look at this in a totality, engagement, share of voice, sentiment of conversation, value of content, assessing an influencer's piece of content, having measurable creativity goals and sort of scoring, it all adds up, and it should always add up to help you build brand affinity. But I always say this, we must be very clear about what the objective is. If brands want a quick stint, then it's engagement and reach. But if you're doing bigger work to build long-term trust for your brand, you want long-term engagement and conversation. And that gets a lot more intense in terms of details and KPIs. And we don't always rely purely on programs to help us do that. There's a lot of analytics and strategy thinking that goes into looking and deep diving into those insights and results.
Thank you very much, Sanesh.
Thank you, Sanesh, for being a guest on our webinar. We've unfortunately run out of time. Thank you all for joining our webinar, which we hope has provided you with some insights into influencer marketing. Please feel free to reach out to Waldo or Andre for any advice, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.